Welcome to Surviving Toxic Abuse. This is a channel dedicated to helping people better understand the nature of a relationship with someone who's toxic, specifically looking at narcissistic and borderline abuse and emotional abuse, hidden abuse. And I'm going to create a video specifically on the topic of hidden abuse later on. And it's going to come into this as well because these kind of relationships are insidious because it's just so confusing, and the strain on your mental and physical health is unbearable. So my background is I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a counselor. I'm just a guy who was in a relationship with an abusive partner for 2.5 years, and it was an absolute roller coaster. This person showed me a side of her which was beautiful, and she showed me a side of her that was just downright abusive. And whether they're conscious or unconscious of that is up for debate. But the impact it has on us isn't. So if you have been in this type of relationship, I don't know where you are on your journey. I myself am now 10 months down the line out of the relationship. And it's been 10 months of exploring, understanding, and healing. And it's the healing that's really important. On this video today, I want to talk about labels. And are labels important? And I think, weirdly, the dichotomy of it is that, yes, it is important. But at the same time, no, it isn't. And I'll get into that. So when I was in my relationship, I knew that something wasn't right. I hadn't experienced this before previously. I was previously in a marriage for 14 years, and it was very happy. And it ended sadly, but it was a healthy relationship. And when that relationship ended, we spoke, we communicated, there was closure, and I wasn't traumatized coming out of it. Whereas after 2.5 years with a person who was toxic, I was completely and utterly traumatized. I was traumatized whilst I was in it, but the relationship was so intense, the roller coaster, the intermittent reinforcement, I never really had the space and time to get clear on what was going on. I knew that something wasn't right, but I was completely uneducated around personality disorders, and specifically in the context of a romantic relationship and the abuse that can be inflicted upon someone who is in a partnership, a relationship with someone with a cluster B personality disorder. I knew something was wrong. I didn't know whether she had bipolar. I suspected. I didn't know whether, she had confided to me that she had some sort of traumatic events in her life. She spoke about how she'd been in an abusive relationship with her previous husband, how she'd been used and abused by people. She was in New Zealand, in Christchurch at the time of the earthquake, which I think, if memory serves, was in 2011, I think, 2010, 2011, which was quite traumatic. So I didn't know whether she had a level of sort of PTSD, which was sort of causing this behaviour in her. But there was so much more to it. There was the grandiosity, there was the entitlement, there was this black and white thinking, there was the way that she could just split. And 1 minute everything was fine, the next minute it was, chaos. 1 minute you're the best person in the world, the next minute you're Satan's spawn. So it was only after I came out of the relationship that I really sort of dug into it. And the penny dropped for me one day when I was talking about my relationship with somebody, and they said to me, this is emotional abuse. And my ex actually once called me a narcissist and wanted me to admit and take complete ownership of the fact that every issue in our relationship was down to me, and the fact that I was a narcissist and that I was the problem. So complete and utter deflection. And so that term, that word, narcissist, in combination with the fact that someone had said to me, this sounds like you've gone through emotional abuse, led me into researching and trying to understand what it was I went through. And doing that, you start to hear about these labels. You hear these diagnoses such as narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, borderline personality disorder, BPD. There's other types as well. There's histrionic personality disorder. There's antisocial personality disorder. I mean, you've got people that are just psychopathic. And I think everybody's going to be different because not everybody's going to have the same background. They didn't have the same exact childhood. They haven't had the exact same lived experience. So it's going to, I suppose, manifest in different ways. But interestingly, what I have found is that the way that manifests into their relationship is often very consistent, let's just say. And I've heard the phrase before that, it's like they all have read the same playbook. Perhaps there's an element of truth in the sense that it's very similar. So a big thing for me in terms of trying to understand and get the closure that I could never get from her was, is she a narcissist? Or has she got borderline personality disorder? Has she got a combination co-occurring? And I would dive down the rabbit hole of research and watching videos and listening to audio books and discussing it with people. I think I mentioned on my previous video that one of my friends is a doctor and she knew her. And she confided into me at the end of the relationship. Well, first of all, she said to me, "Thank God you're out of that relationship." And she has threatened to never speak to me again if I ever got back together with her. But she said to me that she was convinced that she had emotional unstable personality disorder, which is effectively borderline personality disorder. And so you then start going down the rabbit hole of researching borderlines. What's the difference between a borderline and a narcissist? What's the difference between the gender in this? How does a female narcissist or borderline differ from a male narcissist and borderline? And then you hear terms like covert narcissist and grandiose narcissist and how they're different. You hear about the vulnerable narcissist. And in your head, you become almost obsessed with trying to pinpoint and identify the label, the diagnosis of that individual. And you think it's important because if you can get the answers, if you can narrow down what it was that this person is, what their diagnosis is, if you can work that out, then you can try and understand, you can get the healing, you can get the closure. I remember a part of me when I was going through a lot of the sort of trauma and the cognitive dissonance around it all, and you're trauma bonded to that person, and I'll definitely make a video about the trauma bond. You think if you can better understand what their condition is, then you'll be able to help them, that you'll be able to better navigate your way through it. It's like a puzzle. If I can solve the puzzle, then I can make everything better. And it's that's the complete head screw. I'll mind my language, but that's the complete head screw in the situation, and you just confuse yourself. So I'm going back to what I said at the beginning. I think to some extent it is important because researching this and better understanding what you've gone through and who that individual was can help you to understand the situation, and through that you can start to heal. You can take the appropriate steps, because healing from this kind of relationship is different to healing from a normal breakup. And again, I'll talk about that in later videos. But people, when I was going through a real hard time earlier in the year, and I had this trauma bond, which meant that effectively I had Stockholm syndrome. I was in love with my abuser, and I wanted my abuser back. I needed my drug. I'd been so conditioned into normalizing the relationship, that now I'm out of it, I need it again. And when I spoke to certain friends who have never had this type of relationship, they just couldn't get it. They were like, just move on, you know, find somebody new, and it's a new, get yourself into a new relationship. And people just don't get it. If you've not been in this situation, if you've not worn those shoes, you just cannot wrap your head around the impact it has on the individual. So this is where I suppose having a label is important, because the healing part of this is going to be different to a normal relationship. Um, I've heard the analogy before of, like, if you break your leg, time isn't going to be a great healer. Eventually you will get some level of healing, but if you break that bone in your leg, unless it's been set by a doctor, you've had a cast, and maybe you need to do physiotherapy as well. You're not going to regain the normal function of your leg. In this case, time isn't a great healer. And the same thing can be applied, I think, to coming out of a toxic and abusive relationship. It's that you do need that support. You do need to do work on yourself, whether it's counseling, whether it's getting help from a coach. Possibly, I myself went on to antidepressants. I had no choice. I was so low. But the fact is, you need to do something. You can't just you can't take an attitude that time is going to heal all these wounds, because it won't. It will just sit there. So perhaps this is where having that label helps, because then you can take the right measures. Where labels don't really make a difference is that the fact is, you was in a toxic and abusive relationship, and that's what I was in. And at the end of the day, that's the key thing here. Regardless of whether they've got a personality disorder or they don't, regardless of whether they've got NPD or BPD or combination thereof, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter to some extent, because it's abuse. And this is where you then have to start to put the focus on you and your healing journey, and you have to shift your energy away from that abusive person. Abuse is abuse at the end of the day, whether that's from a romantic partner, a family member, a friend, your boss, a colleague, the next door neighbor. At the end of the day, if people are making you feel like crap, if they're crushing your self-esteem and your self-worth, if they're making you hurt, they've got you down on your knees and almost sadistically they're getting a rise out of it, then that's abuse. And no one should have to put up with that. So at the end of the day, I think labels help, because, as I say, you can then sort of effectively, it's almost like trying to get a diagnosis for yourself. If you've got a pain, an ambiguous pain in your chest, you'll go to the doctor to try and get the diagnosis so you can get the right medication. So this is where I think having that label for the abusive partner can help you take the right course of action. Because one of the things that you have to do, and I've had to do this, is try and understand why you enabled it. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's a real psychological game they play with the whole love bombing at the beginning. And then the intermittent reinforcement sort of creates that trauma bond. And then effectively, you are glued to them. They've got you. And it's very difficult to get out of that spider's web once you're in it. But you also have to, ask, well, why did I enable that? Why didn't I have enough strength and self-worth and self-esteem to walk away? So labeling can help, but at the end of the day, having a label for that person isn't going to make a huge amount of difference in the end, because when you look back in years to come, when you've gone through your healing journey and you've grown and you're in a much better place, you'll just look back and you can just say to yourself, well, that was an abusive person, and that was abuse, and abuse shouldn't be tolerated. So I hope that helps. I appreciate that I've got a conflicting view around this, in the sense that I've acknowledged that labeling can be beneficial, but at the same time, labeling doesn't change the fact that abuse is abuse, and you have to put your energy and your focus into yourself. So yes, so in my next video, I'm going to be talking about cycles of abuse, and I hope you can join me for that one. If you like this video, please do like, do subscribe, and I hope to see you on the next one. Thanks.